Hello, my friends. Hello, and welcome once again to Stately Von Manor, where Roger and I have returned. Because it's Wednesday. That means it's Epic Comic Book Wednesday. Every Wednesday, we'll talk about a certain comic book, graphic novel, or comic book subject. Steve Donoghue on his channel will talk about the same comic book, graphic novel, or comic book subject. It is our world's finest team up that we do once a week. And this week, Roger, we're doing something a little different. We are talking about a specific comic book, but we're talking about something a little larger than that, which this comic book made me think of, which is the weirdness. It's weird to me. There's some weirdness involved in turning a television show into a comic book. The results are always a little off sometimes, even though they can be quite good. Because they're very different things. And forever in comic books, they've been turning movies into comics, they've been adapting films into comics, and they've been adapting television shows into comics for years and years. And back in the old days, it was probably a little bit easier. Back in the old days, there wasn't such a thing as serialized television, really, except for the daytime soap operas. But for most television shows, there was a real effort made to make everything go back to the status quo by the end of the episode. Everything at the end of the episode was kind of the same as things were in the beginning of the episode. And there was not a lot of continuity between the shows, story-wise, and that was because in the old days of television, TV shows could be preempted by some dumb sporting event, or some news item could break in onto your television show, or the show could just be rescheduled without you knowing it. You know, all kinds of things could happen back in the olden days before streaming, or even way in the olden days before VCRs or TiVo came out and you could record your shows. Back in the old days, you had to actually be there at whatever time it was to watch whatever show you wanted to watch, which meant that very often you missed it. And so shows were not serialized, really. Regular primetime drama shows were not too serialized until the 1990s, really. And even then, just a bit. But there were exceptions to that, but for the most part, that's how it was. Which would make your job as somebody creating a comic book off of your television show while the show was airing easier. It's a different thing with the comic book that I'm talking about today, where they're doing a comic book on a television show that's been off the air for over 20 years. I don't even know how long Voyager has been off the air, but that's what we're talking about as the main comic that we're talking about today, which is going to be this. This is Voyager Homecoming, which is a new comic book series based on Star Trek Voyager. And who does this? I have it on my tablet here. Okay, so the writers of this are Susan Bridges and Tilly Bridges, and the artist is Angel Hernandez. And this is a comic book that made me think of this subject today, because there's some weirdness involved in this comic book, as there often is. And, you know, like I was just saying, back in the old days of Star Trek, we're using Star Trek as an example of this, although they made comic books on all kinds of different television shows. Back in the old days, when this old-timey Star Trek comic book came out, and this comic book had its own brand of weirdness anyway, which I've talked about before, but it would be easier to make a comic book on Star Trek, the original series, because it was really, you know, everything was back to the status quo by the end of every episode. So it was easier to make individual Star Trek episodes, or Star Trek comic book stories, just like those episodes. Although, like I said, this original Star Trek series of comics had its own issues. As far as being like the television show, there were a lot of differences. which didn't mean it was bad. I think that actually adds something to this comic book. But when you get back, or when you go later into the 1980s, when Star Trek The Next Generation was on the air, this is a Star Trek The Next Generation comic book that came out during the second season of Star Trek The Next Generation. So the Star Trek The Next Generation was a little bit more difficult because it, again, not a serialized show, but it had a little bit more continuity in it than the original show did as far as episode to episode, but not much at this point. And so again, they're making a comic book based on a show that was currently airing. And one of the difficulties in adapting a show, particularly an ongoing show, is that nothing that you did in the comic book was going to affect the show in any way. But the show would any changes in the show would very much affect the comic book. Because the comic book, it's not canon, right? It doesn't actually exist in the world of the television show that's being aired. It only exists in its own comic book version of that. So everything in the television show is real in the comic, but the comic is not real as far as the television show is concerned. And this could lead to difficulties. It led to a lot of difficulties in the comic book that was being made on the original Star Trek movies, because between films they had a comic book going and they had no idea what was going to happen in the next movie. So you could see the same thing in Marvel's old Star Wars series of comic books, where they had to do a continuing series of stories on Star Wars, and they had no idea what was going to happen, for example, in The Empire Strikes Back before it came out. And then after The Empire Strikes Back, they had to somehow make a comic book, a continuing Star Wars comic book, that was going for like 2 or 3 years until Return of the Jedi came out, and nobody knew. Like, what do you do? Han Solo is frozen, and he's like frozen for like 3 years while you're doing this comic book. That was a challenge they had to deal with. Here in today's comic book, the Voyager comic book, it's a little different because we've got a show that's been off the air for decades. And one of the reasons this comic book exists, I think, is because this is called Star Trek Voyager Homecoming. And Star Trek Voyager as a television show did not have the most satisfying last episode. It wasn't bad from what I remember. I only saw it once, and I saw it when it aired, and that's the last time I saw it. Star Trek Voyager is my least favorite of the original Star Trek shows, which doesn't mean it was bad. It just means that I liked it less than all the other Star Trek shows, including Enterprise. I even liked Enterprise more than Voyager. But Voyager was a weird show because it was kind of like a weird combination between Star Trek and Lost in Space, where you had Voyager, the starship, excuse me, Roger, the starship that was sent out into space by some incident so far out into space that it would take him like 90 years to get back or whatever on full warp. And there was no help from the Federation. The Federation was too far away, so they were all on their own, which is a pretty good setup. And I don't think Voyager ever made the most of it. There were a lot of setups, for example, in the first episodes of Voyager that they never really paid off too much, I think. But by the last episode, you had the last episode it didn't give you everything that you wanted. They get back to Earth, they find their way back, and then it ended pretty much, except for like one scene or whatever, when I remember. But there was a lot of things that you would want to see when these characters came back after being gone for so long. And you didn't see any of that. You never actually saw them, get back to Earth and try to readjust. And, there was some, Tuvok the Vulcan still had a disease that he needed to, take care of. Was it? We assume, yeah, we guess it was, but we never saw it. There was a lot of stuff going on that, from what I remember, like I said, it's been a long time since I've seen it, that left people dissatisfied. Well, now we have a comic book written specifically to go back to that event, Voyager returning to the Earth, and expand on that story. At least that was the idea going in, and there's only been one issue so far. And it has some of the wonky weirdness that you often see in comic book adaptations of television and films. The artists and the writers have to get the characters right, and they have to draw the actors. And one of the things that you see sometimes when they do this, and you saw this a lot in these old Star Trek comics. An example is here, where you have the character being drawn, and it's being drawn from a photograph. And you see that a lot in the old Star Trek comics, and in a lot of other comic books that are based on films or television, where you can almost see the photo or the still that they're drawing from. And then in the rest of the comic, the characters look a little wonky. And you always have that in adaptations. Sometimes there are exceptions. Marvel did some adaptations of Planet of the Apes movies back in the 70s, years after the movies had come out. And they didn't have the rights to any of the likenesses of the actors. So they just made all the characters look totally different, all the human characters. But usually they're trying to make the characters recognizable. I think this Voyager comic, does a good job of that. Here is an example of a page. And you can see the artwork is actually quite good. And here on this page, Captain Janeway is reviewing some of the past adventures of Voyager, and you see some scenes and characters from things that you would be familiar with if you had been watching Voyager. And so the writers of this comic book know Voyager. They know this television show, which is important. And I think the artist does a pretty good job of capturing the likenesses without it being too strange. I think the art in this comic is actually really quite good. The story so far, the one thing that we want to see in this comic is we want to see our characters get home. And we want to see what happens to our characters when they get home and how they readjust to life and whatever. How does that happen? And we don't get any of that in the first issue. What we actually get is an alien invasion of Voyager. And so it turns into, quite quickly, this comic book, it turns into an episode of Voyager, what feels just like an episode of Voyager. And one thing I've noticed about adaptations of television shows, whether it's a book or a comic, is very often they come across as kind of mid-level episodes of whatever show they're talking about. Even the good comics feel like that. Because like I said, you usually can't have too much character development in a lot of these. This one, you have a lot more freedom because it takes place outside of the show that's already been done. We already know all of these characters. And theoretically, they could do a lot with these characters in a show that's been over forever. But they don't. This turns quite quickly into just an episode of Voyager. They're going home, and they're almost to Earth. And Admiral Paris and some other Starfleet personnel beam onto Voyager. And these are and Admiral Paris is a character we know from the show. He helped the Voyager starship get back to Earth. But it turns out that, and this is a spoiler alert for this first issue, it turns out that Admiral Paris is really an alien, and the other characters, the other Starfleet personnel, are also aliens, and so now Voyager has to deal with this alien infiltration of their ship, which is, fine. It's just another episode of Voyager. But was that really what we wanted going into this comic book? Another episode of Voyager? We got plenty of those. And so they have to take care of the aliens before they get back to Earth. And is this a sign of a bigger alien infiltration of the Earth? None of this, all of this stuff, we've seen a million times before. And the way that they find out the aliens are aliens is ridiculous. There's one really ridiculous plot point in this story where the Doctor has to convince the aliens to let him get blood tests from them, before while they're still impersonating humans, which they wouldn't allow him to do under any circumstances. But for the sake of the plot, he had to get away with it. There's a certain amount of ridiculousness in this plot, and for it to work. And to be fair, this is something we saw in Voyager a lot. Voyager was one of those shows, a Star Trek show, which was, it had some great episodes. It had a lot of episodes that were not so great. And this series, it's only one issue in, but it has, if you read it, it has all the weirdness that you would expect in a comic book based on a television show. One thing I will say, like I said, they did a pretty good job on the likenesses of the characters, and so it wasn't too distracting. But the story itself, it might just end up being what a lot of these comic books are, which is just a typical episode of the show. This, I think, has the promise of being something different, the promise of showing something that we haven't seen before. And to be fair, a lot of comics based on shows that are over do that. Because they have a lot more freedom with a show that's been done for 20-something years. But this could lead to its own issues. I remember the X-Files comic book. So there was an X-Files comic book, which took place after the show ended. And so you had to figure out how you're going to bring back these characters after that ending. And one of the things they did in that comic book is they brought back the Lone Gunman, a group of characters that had died during the X-Files. But they just brought them back with some excuse and say, okay, so these guys are still alive. And that's how it was in the comic book. But then, years later, the television show actually returned. X-Files actually returned for a couple seasons. It probably shouldn't have. They had to give you another bad ending to the X-Files. One bad ending wasn't enough. They had to give you another one. But in that show, the Lone Gunmen were dead. They were still dead. And so everything in the comic book, it was, as comic books based on TV or movies often are, it's not part of continuity. And now it's just this weird thing that exists in an alternate universe. Voyager, I don't know that Voyager will ever come back, but you never know. And this particular time in Voyager can't be refilmed, probably. So they have a lot of freedom to do something different with this comic. But so far in the first issue, it's just another episode of Voyager. Not bad. Some ridiculous moments. But it's just another episode, which is the way it is with a lot of the older Star Trek comics. There are other Star Trek comics out there that do different things. But so far, this Voyager comic, I don't know. We'll have to see how it goes. But the first issue definitely made me think of all of these things. And I'll shut up now because I've just been rambling, but it's early. It's not even 5. Okay, guys, I will catch you next time.